What if the biggest stars of Hollywood's golden age were actually terrible actors? While critics savagely tore apart performances, calling them wooden and lifeless, audiences didn't care. These stars built empires on everything except acting ability, proving that sometimes charisma trumps talent. Tab Hunter. Tab Hunter was the quintessential 1950s teen idol, but critics absolutely destroyed his performances. Born Arthur Gallion, he was transformed by Agent Henry Wilson into the perfect all-American dream boy. Critics consistently called his performances wooden and lifeless, with one reviewer noting that Hunter delivers his lines like someone who's memorized them phonetically without understanding their meaning. In Battle Cry, despite being the lead, critics noted he was completely overshadowed by his more experienced co-stars, with one writing that Hunter stands around looking wholesome while actual actors create characters around him. His emotional range was brutally mocked, with Variety observing that Hunter's emotional range extends from mildly cheerful to slightly less cheerful. When he left Warner Bros., his roles immediately went to Troy Donahue, another manufactured heartthrob. Critics joked that Hunter acted like someone who's surprised to find himself in movies and isn't quite sure what he's supposed to be doing. Yet teenage audiences adored his clean-cut image, making him one of the most popular stars of his era. His comeback in John Waters' Polyester decades later showed he finally learned to embrace the joke. Hunter's story proves that sometimes being perfectly cast as yourself is enough. Troy Donahue. Troy Donahue was Tab Hunter's replacement at Warner Bros., and critics were equally vicious about his acting abilities. Born Merle Johnson Jr., he was another Henry Wilson creation who looked perfect but acted terribly. Critics consistently described his performances as vacant and empty, with one reviewer noting that Donahue delivers his lines like someone who's just woken up and isn't sure where he is. His breakthrough film, A Summer Place, made him a teen idol, but critics were merciless. The director later admitted it took 11 or 12 takes before you could get anything out of him. Critics wrote that Donahue's performances suggest someone who's very handsome but perpetually lost, and that watching him attempt to be passionate is like watching someone try to solve a difficult math problem while pretending to be in love. Journalist Rick Dubrow wrote devastatingly that Troy is big and strong and has the rare ability to make the most glamorous and exciting events seem colorless and flat. His co-stars described him as isolated and uncomfortable, with many noting he seemed more interested in his appearance than his performance. Despite the critical savaging, Donahue's films were box office hits, particularly with teenage girls who found his sensitive, vulnerable appearance irresistible. His later struggles with addiction and homelessness showed the dark side of manufactured stardom. Donahue's career proved that sometimes looking the part matters more than playing it convincingly. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was one of Hollywood's biggest stars, but critics consistently questioned his acting abilities throughout his career. Early in his career, he was famously almost fired from his first film for being unable to deliver lines coherently, freezing up completely during filming. Critics regularly described his performances as wooden and mechanical, with one reviewer noting that Hudson acts like someone who's been given detailed instructions on how to be a movie star, but forgot to learn how to be human. In All That Heaven Allows, despite being the romantic lead, critics observed that Hudson is handsome and somewhat wooden, laconic of speech, and it's at times hard to understand his passion for the widow. His idea of conveying emotion was described by critics as speaking slightly louder and opening his eyes a bit wider. The New York Times noted his artificial screen presence and suggested his success came from his appearance rather than talent. Critics consistently pointed out his mechanical performances and questioned whether his bland competence constituted real acting ability. One critic wrote that Hudson delivers his lines with the conviction of someone reading from a teleprompter, which may be exactly what he's doing. Yet Hudson's classical good looks and reliable screen presence made him a bankable star for decades. His success in Douglas Sirk melodramas and later comedies with Doris Day proved that audiences loved him regardless of critical opinion. Hudson's career demonstrated that sometimes being consistently competent and incredibly handsome is enough to build a legendary career. Victor Mature. Victor Mature stands apart from other critically mocked actors because he was completely aware of his limitations and embraced them with humor. When rejected by the Los Angeles Country Club for being an actor, he famously quipped, "I'm not an actor, and I've got 64 films to prove it." Critics consistently called his performances wooden and suggested he poses rather than performs, with one noting that Mature acts like someone who's been told that speaking louder makes lines more dramatic. In biblical epics like Samson and Delilah, critics observed that he delivered lines about biblical drama with the same enthusiasm he might use to discuss his workout routine. His dramatic abilities were questioned throughout his career, with critics noting his discomfort with romantic scenes and suggesting he seemed more interested in showing off his physique than creating emotional connections with his co-stars. Yet Mature's honest acknowledgement of his limitations made him more endearing than stars who took themselves too seriously. He once said, "Actually, I am a golfer. That is my real occupation. I never was an actor. Ask anybody, particularly the critics." Critics today actually admire his work in films like My Darling Clementine and Kiss of Death, recognizing that his natural presence and authenticity serve certain roles perfectly. Mature's success proved that sometimes being genuinely yourself, limitations and all, resonates more powerfully than trying to be something you're not. His self-deprecating attitude and professional reliability made him a valuable star despite critical dismissal. John Wayne. John Wayne faced constant criticism throughout his career for his limited range and tendency to play essentially the same character in different settings. Critics noted that Wayne doesn't act, he just shows up and is John Wayne, with reviewers complaining that whether he was playing a cowboy, soldier, or even a Roman centurion, he approached every role with the same drawl and swagger. In The Quiet Man, critics acknowledged the film's charm, but noted that Wayne tries to be charming, but charm requires a lightness he simply doesn't possess. Critics were particularly harsh about his attempts at dramatic acting, with one reviewer writing that Wayne's Ethan Edwards is just John Wayne being angry, instead of John Wayne being stoic. His performances were frequently described as one-note and inflexible, with critics suggesting he was more personality than actor. Contemporary reviewers found his performances limiting, though later critics would appreciate the complexity of films like The Searchers. Critics consistently complained that Wayne seemed to be playing George Wayne in different costumes rather than creating distinct characters. Yet Wayne understood that audiences came to see John Wayne, not complex character studies. Where critics saw limitation, fans saw reliable masculinity and authentic American values. His consistency became his strength, and his iconic status proved that sometimes being perfectly yourself is more valuable than displaying range. Wayne's career demonstrated that star power and screen presence can matter more than traditional acting ability, and that audiences often prefer familiarity to unpredictability. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston was frequently criticized for his theatrical, over-the-top performances that critics found unsuited to film. Critics noted his bombastic delivery and suggested he acted like he was performing for the back row of a theater rather than movie cameras. They described him as hammy and overwrought, questioning whether his biblical, epic style translated effectively to more intimate dramas. In Touch of Evil, critics noted he was completely outclassed by Orson Welles' subtle direction and performance, with one writing that Heston acts like someone who thinks shouting equals passion and gesturing equals emotion. His tendency toward grandiose gestures was a frequent target, with The Hollywood Reporter observing that Heston approaches every scene as if he's delivering the Gettysburg Address to a crowd of thousands, even when he's supposed to be having an intimate conversation. Critics were particularly harsh about his attempts at contemporary roles, suggesting his theatrical style only worked in period pieces. One reviewer wrote that Heston in modern dress looks like someone who's lost at a costume party. Yet Heston's commanding presence and stentorian voice perfectly suited the epic films that made him famous. Where critics saw overacting, audiences saw authority and gravitas appropriate to larger-than-life characters. His Oscar-winning performance in Ben-Hur proved that sometimes bigger really is better. Heston's success in spectaculars showed that different genres require different acting styles, and that what critics consider excessive can be exactly what certain stories need. His career proved that epic performances require epic actors. Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy, America's most decorated World War II soldier, was frequently criticized for his wooden acting, despite his impressive real-life heroism. Critics noted that Murphy's authenticity in war scenes cannot compensate for his stiff delivery in dramatic moments, with reviewers suggesting his fame came from his war record rather than acting ability. Ironically, in To Hell and Back, where he played himself, critics found it ironic that he seemed uncomfortable recreating his own heroic actions, with one writing that Murphy looks more natural in actual combat footage than in the dramatic recreations of his own experiences. His performances were described as sincere but limited and heroic but hollow. Critics consistently noted his discomfort with romantic scenes and civilian roles, with Variety observing that Murphy can convince audiences he's a war hero because he actually was one, but he can't convince them he's a lover, a father, or really anything else. The Hollywood Reporter noted that Murphy acts like someone who wishes he were anywhere else, which makes it difficult for audiences to invest in his characters. Critics also pointed out Murphy's obvious discomfort with the Hollywood lifestyle and his apparent lack of interest in developing his craft. However, audiences appreciated Murphy's genuine modesty and authentic military bearing. Where critics saw acting limitations, fans saw real American heroism and unpretentious masculinity. His story represented the American dream and reminded audiences of recent sacrifices for freedom. Murphy's success proved that authenticity and genuine heroism can transcend traditional acting skills. Steve Reeves. Steve Reeves revolutionized the sword and sandal genre with his impressive physique, but critics consistently questioned his dramatic abilities. The New York Times wrote that Mr. Reeves seems more comfortable lifting weights than lifting dialogue off the page, with critics frequently noting his wooden delivery and suggesting he was cast purely for his physical appearance. In Hercules, his most famous role, critics observed that he delivered lines about mythological adventures with the same enthusiasm he might use to discuss his workout routine. His performances were often described as statuesque, meant as criticism rather than compliment. One critic wrote that Reeves doesn't so much act as pose while other people speak around him. He's less Hercules than a very muscular piece of furniture. Critics noted that Reeves seemed genuinely uncomfortable with dialogue scenes, with Variety observing that, in action sequences, Reeves looks like a god, but in dramatic scenes, he looks like someone desperately searching for the exit. The critical consensus was that he was more suited to modeling than acting, with reviews suggesting his appeal was purely visual. Yet international audiences, particularly in Europe, embraced Reeves's films with enthusiasm. His physical credibility in mythological roles satisfied audiences who wanted spectacular entertainment rather than subtle character studies. Reeves later admitted he never considered himself an actor, viewing his film career as a way to capitalize on his bodybuilding success. His honesty about his limitations made him more endearing to fans who appreciated his unpretentious approach to larger-than-life characters. George Raft. George Raft was frequently criticized for his limited range and tendency to play similar tough guy roles throughout his career. Critics noted that he seems to be playing George Raft in different costumes rather than creating distinct characters, with his real-life associations with organized crime giving his performances authenticity but also limiting his versatility. Critics often dismissed him as one-note and suggested his success came from typecasting rather than acting ability. One critic wrote devastatingly that Raft doesn't act tough, he just is tough, which is a different thing entirely. In Scarface, critics acknowledged his effectiveness but questioned whether it was actually acting, with The Hollywood Reporter observing that Raft's performance works because he's essentially playing what he knows, but that's not necessarily acting. Critics also noted his stiff delivery and repetitive characterizations, with one reviewer writing that watching a George Raft film is like watching the same performance with different supporting casts and locations. His dramatic range was consistently questioned, with critics suggesting he brought the same persona to every role regardless of the character's supposed background or motivation. However, audiences appreciated Raft's authentic tough guy persona and his ability to bring credibility to gangster roles that trained actors couldn't match. His real-life background added a layer of authenticity that made his performances compelling even when they weren't technically accomplished. Raft's success proved that sometimes life experience and natural presence can be more valuable than formal training. His consistent persona became his brand, and audiences knew exactly what they were getting when they bought a ticket to a George Raft film. Fernando Lamas. Fernando Lamas was often criticized for playing stereotypical Latin lover roles with exaggerated charm and accent, with critics writing that he seems more interested in displaying his charisma than developing characters. The critical establishment frequently dismissed him as all style and swagger with little emotional depth beneath the romantic facade. In The Merry Widow, critics noted that Lamas seemed to be performing for himself rather than his co-stars, with one reviewer writing that Lamas acts like someone who's constantly checking his reflection in shop windows. His thick accent was often mentioned as a barrier to more diverse roles, but critics also noted that he seemed to exaggerate it for effect. The New York Times observed that Lamas lays on the Latin charm with the subtlety of someone painting a barn. In dramatic scenes requiring emotional vulnerability, critics found Lamas particularly unconvincing, with one writing that, when the script calls for sensitivity, Lamas responds by lowering his voice and flashing his teeth more slowly. Hardly the stuff of great acting. Critics suggested his performances felt calculated rather than natural, and that he was more caricature than character. Yet Lamas understood his market perfectly and delivered exactly what audiences wanted: exotic romance and continental sophistication. His self-aware approach to his screen persona made him popular with viewers who appreciated his tongue-in-cheek style. Lamas famously said, "I don't act, I react," which critics saw as an admission of his limitations, but audiences found charmingly honest. His son Lorenzo later achieved similar success, suggesting that understanding your appeal matters more than expanding your range. Alan Ladd. Alan Ladd was frequently criticized for his cold, distant screen presence and monotone delivery. Critics noted that he seemed more comfortable in action scenes than emotional ones, and that his performances lacked warmth and accessibility. The critical consensus was that Ladd's icy demeanor limited his range and made him unsuitable for romantic leads. In The Great Gatsby, critics were particularly harsh about his interpretation of the title character, with one writing that Ladd's Gatsby has all the romantic passion of a banker discussing interest rates. Critics also frequently mentioned his shorter stature as limiting his leading man potential, though this physical characteristic actually enhanced his appeal in certain roles. One reviewer noted that Ladd's size makes him an unlikely action hero, which somehow makes his tough guy roles more interesting. In Shane, supposedly Ladd's best performance, critics were divided, with some appreciating his understated approach, while others found it simply underwhelming. The Hollywood Reporter wrote that Ladd's Shane is certainly mysterious, but one wonders if that's because the character has depth or because Ladd has so little expression. Critics consistently described his performances as emotionally remote and suggested he was better suited to film noir than romantic roles. However, Ladd's cool, mysterious quality perfectly matched the film noir and Western genres where he found success. Audiences appreciated his understated anti-heroic characters that reflected post-war disillusionment. His limitation became his strength in the right context, proving that the right actor in the right genre can overcome critical disapproval. Van Johnson. Van Johnson was MGM's designated boy next door, but critics often found his performances too lightweight for serious dramatic roles. Variety wrote that Mr. Johnson brings infectious enthusiasm to roles that might benefit from more emotional depth and masculine authority, with critics noting his pleasant but limited dramatic range. His freckled, youthful appearance was seen as a limitation when approaching adult themes, with one critic writing that Johnson's biggest problem is convincing audiences he's old enough to have the problems his characters face. In Command Decision, where Johnson played a military officer, critics were particularly harsh, with The Hollywood Reporter noting that Johnson tries to convey military authority, but comes across as a college student playing dress-up in his father's uniform. The most frequent criticism was that Johnson never seemed to mature as a performer, with one critic observing that Johnson at 35 acts exactly the same as Johnson at 25. He's trapped in a perpetual adolescence that works for some roles but severely limits his range. Critics suggested he was better suited to musicals and light comedies than serious dramas, questioning his ability to handle adult themes convincingly. However, audiences, particularly women, found Johnson's everyman quality endearing and relatable. Where critics saw limitations, fans saw genuine likability and trustworthiness. His freckled face became synonymous with wholesome American masculinity, and his appeal endured despite critical reservations. Johnson's success proved that audiences often prefer relatable charm to dramatic intensity, and that staying true to your natural persona can be more valuable than trying to stretch beyond your comfort zone. Jeff Chandler. Jeff Chandler was frequently praised for his impressive physical presence, but criticized for his dramatic limitations. Critics noted his rigid delivery and suggested he was more suited to action roles than character studies, with the critical consensus being that Chandler was competent but uninspiring, and that his performances lacked the emotional complexity of his contemporaries. In Broken Arrow, his Oscar-nominated performance, critics gave him credit for sincerity but questioned his range, with one writing that Chandler means well, but meaning well isn't the same as acting well. Critics consistently noted that Chandler seemed uncomfortable in romantic scenes, with Variety observing that Chandler approaches love scenes like a man discussing business contracts, technically proficient but emotionally distant. His deep voice and imposing stature were appreciated, but critics felt he relied too heavily on these physical attributes. The Hollywood Reporter noted that Chandler acts with his voice and bearing, but rarely with his heart or imagination. Critics suggested his performances were more about presence than actual acting ability, with many noting that he seemed to substitute physical authority for emotional depth. However, Chandler's reliability and strong screen presence made him a popular leading man in action films and westerns. Audiences appreciated his straightforward, no-nonsense approach to heroic roles, finding his consistency reassuring rather than limiting. Chandler's premature death cut short any potential evolution as a performer, but critics had already established their opinion that he was a limited but serviceable leading man, rather than a genuine actor. His career proved that sometimes being reliably competent is enough to build a successful career in Hollywood. Rory Calhoun. Rory Calhoun was frequently criticized for his limited acting range and tendency to rely on his rugged appearance rather than dramatic ability. Critics noted that he seems more comfortable with action than dialogue, and that his performances were serviceable but unremarkable. The critical establishment often dismissed him as a reliable but unexceptional Western star who succeeded more on his look than his talent. In The Silver Whip, critics observed that he delivered lines like someone reading from a script for the first time, with one critic writing that Calhoun's dialogue delivery suggests he's more familiar with horses than with human conversation. Critics also noted his apparent discomfort in dramatic scenes requiring emotional depth, with the New York Times observing that when the script calls for vulnerability, Calhoun responds by looking confused as if the director is speaking a foreign language. His dramatic abilities were consistently questioned in reviews, with critics suggesting he was better suited to silent films where his rugged appearance could carry the performance without dialogue. One reviewer wrote that Calhoun works best when he's not required to speak. Critics frequently noted that his performances seemed more authentic when he was on horseback than when he was required to engage in human conversation or emotional scenes. Yet Calhoun found his niche in B-westerns and action films, where his authentic cowboy persona and physical credibility satisfied audiences looking for straightforward entertainment. His real-life background as a rodeo performer added authenticity to his Western roles that trained actors couldn't match. Calhoun's success proved that sometimes being genuinely what you appear to be is more valuable than technical acting skills. Agar. John Agar was frequently criticized for his wooden performances, with critics noting that his early success seemed to come from his marriage to Shirley Temple rather than his acting ability. Critics described his performances as amateurish and unconvincing, with the critical establishment often suggesting that Agar was in over his head in leading roles and would be better suited to supporting parts. In Fort Apache, critics noted that he looked like an amateur playing soldier next to John Wayne's professional military bearing, with one critic writing that Agar tries to convey authority but comes across as a child playing dress-up in his father's uniform. His dramatic abilities were consistently questioned throughout his career, with critics noting his stiff line delivery and apparent discomfort with emotional scenes. The New York Times observed that Agar acts like someone who's surprised to find himself in movies and isn't quite sure what he's supposed to be doing. Critics were particularly harsh about his science fiction films, where his wooden delivery made even absurd plots seem more ridiculous. In Tarantula, one reviewer wrote that Agar delivers warnings about giant spiders with less conviction than most people order coffee. His performances were often described as uncertain and unprofessional, with many critics suggesting he seemed overwhelmed by the demands of leading man roles. However, Agar found success in B-movies and science fiction films, where his earnest everyman quality worked well. Audiences appreciated his unpretentious approach to heroic roles in genre films, where authenticity mattered less than sincerity. His career proved that sometimes being in the right place at the right time can overcome limitations in traditional acting ability. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was frequently criticized for relying on his natural charm rather than developing genuine acting skills. Critics noted that he plays himself in different costumes and that his performances were more personality than performance. The critical establishment often suggested that Flynn's success came from his roguish charisma rather than dramatic ability. In The Adventures of Robin Hood, critics acknowledged the film's entertainment value, but noted that Flynn seemed to be having more fun than his character should be having, with one critic writing that Flynn approaches dramatic scenes like someone who's just heard a good joke and is trying not to laugh. His tendency to seem like he was enjoying himself more than his characters were frequently mentioned in reviews, with critics noting that Flynn's obvious pleasure in his work often broke the dramatic illusion. Variety observed that Flynn acts like someone who can't believe he's being paid to play dress-up. Critics were particularly harsh about Flynn's attempts at serious dramatic roles, suggesting he was better suited to adventure films where his limitations were less obvious. The New York Times wrote that Flynn in drama is like watching someone try to be serious while wearing a party hat. Critics consistently noted that his performances seemed effortless to the point of carelessness, suggesting he wasn't taking his craft seriously enough. However, Flynn's infectious enthusiasm and natural screen presence made him perfect for swashbuckling adventures. Where critics saw limitation, audiences saw genuine fun and romantic excitement that made them feel like they were having adventures too. Flynn's career proved that sometimes bringing joy to your work is more valuable than demonstrating technical skill. Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor was dubbed MGM's Man with the Perfect Profile, but critics consistently questioned whether his beauty translated into compelling performances. Variety wrote that Mr. Taylor's performances are as immaculate and emotionally distant as his appearance, with critics frequently noting his wooden delivery and suggesting he was a product of studio marketing rather than genuine talent. In Camille, opposite Greta Garbo, critics observed the painful contrast between Garbo's passionate performance and Taylor's mechanical line reading, with one critic writing that Taylor stands next to Garbo like a beautiful statue next to a living, breathing woman. His dramatic abilities were consistently questioned throughout his career, with critics noting that he seemed more concerned with his appearance than his performance. The New York Times observed that Taylor approaches every scene as if he's posing for a magazine cover rather than creating a character. In action films and westerns, critics found Taylor more acceptable because the genres didn't require much emotional range, with one reviewer noting that Taylor works in westerns because cowboys are supposed to be strong and silent, though in Taylor's case, it's more vacant than strong. Critics frequently described his performances as emotionally empty and suggested he was more concerned with maintaining his image than developing his craft. Yet Taylor's appeal endured for decades because audiences appreciated his reliability and classical good looks. Where critics saw emptiness, fans saw consistency and understated elegance. His longevity proved that audiences valued different qualities than critics, and that sometimes being perfectly cast as a romantic ideal is enough to sustain a career. Rhonda Fleming. Rhonda Fleming was nicknamed the Queen of Technicolor for her striking red hair and beauty, but critics often suggested her appeal was purely visual. The Hollywood Reporter noted that Miss Fleming photographs beautifully but struggles to bring depth to her characters, with critics frequently describing her performances as lovely but shallow and suggesting she was better suited to being a model than an actress. In Spellbound, critics noted that she was completely overshadowed by Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck, with one critic writing that Fleming stands around looking gorgeous while actual actors carry the dramatic weight. Her dramatic range was consistently questioned in reviews, with critics noting that she seemed to approach every role with the same pleasant but vacant expression. One critic observed that Fleming's emotional range extends from mildly pleased to slightly concerned with occasional forays into moderate happiness. In adventure films like Gunfight at the OK Corral, critics appreciated that the genre didn't require much from her beyond looking beautiful in period costumes, with the New York Times noting that Fleming serves her purpose in Westerns, which is to remind audiences that even the frontier had beautiful women. Critics regularly suggested that her performances lack the substance to match her striking appearance, and that she seemed to be performing for photographers rather than movie cameras. However, Fleming understood her role in Hollywood's visual spectacles and delivered exactly what those films required. Her striking appearance enhanced the Technicolor productions she starred in, making her an integral part of their appeal. Fleming later spoke honestly about her career, acknowledging that she was cast for her looks rather than acting ability, showing a self-awareness that made her more sympathetic than stars who seemed oblivious to their limitations. These stars proved that in Hollywood's golden age, charisma could triumph over craft, and that audiences often cared more about screen presence than acting technique. While critics savaged their performances, these actors understood something their detractors missed. Sometimes being perfectly yourself is more powerful than being technically perfect. Which of these critically dismissed stars do you think actually had more talent than they were credited with? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know if you think audiences or critics were right about these Hollywood legends.